In today's end-of-year finale, I get tired.
That's tiring.
Tony feels how solid it really is.
That felt solid as
And this is one of the most breathtaking shots I have ever captured. All that and more in today's episode. Hello and welcome to the end of year special for Screen Tested. I am your host Tyrant, where we take things from movies, TV shows, pop culture, try to create them in the real world and test them one-on-one from the media that they come from. Now before we get into it, I just wanted to say, honestly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you guys. This year has been awesome. You guys have been awesome. We've also done some really big and crazy projects, things like the Chaos Blades, Geezer's Wheel, the Kanar Bows, a lot of bonk sticks, it turns out. Anyway, it's been a lot of really awesome stuff, and I'm actually a little bit worried that next year I won't be able to top this year, because we just did so much crazy things. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. But in today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at one of the biggest pop culture weapons that I think has ever existed, both figuratively and literally, and that is a giant sword. Every franchise seems to have their own version of a giant sword, and the reason why is because people think it's cool. I think it's cool, but how practical is it? How useful is it? And do they work? That is kind of what we're going to be looking at in today's episode. Now, the reason why I've wanted to do this for a better part of a year is because I have a little bit of a unique take on it, specifically more on the material side of things. But some of the things that I want to accomplish is I want it to be wieldable. I don't want to just create a giant slab of steel that you can't move around and call it a day. I want something that could be plausibly used as a weapon. Now we can get into the debate of, is a giant sword actually a good weapon compared to something like a spear, things like, but in a general sense, if we create one, can we make it functional? That is going to be the goal of today's episode. So with my little preamble out of the way, let's get started. So why do I think that I'm going to succeed with my giant sword project when everybody else has had, middling results? Honestly, it's down to one caveat, and that is the material. I'm willing to work with some more experimental materials in this specific context, and the one that I want to use in today's project is aluminum. Now, a lot of people are immediately going to be, you can't make it out of that. That's not a material for a real weapon. However, a lot of the things that make aluminum a bad, material for something like a regular sword, when you scale them up to a giant sword, I think it can work. So what that means is I can have a much thicker blade relative to steel and still be the same weight as steel. I still want it to be light, of course, but what that means is because I have so much more material on my blade without it weighing too much more, it could work in terms of like a cutting edge, right? Aluminum doesn't have good edge retention because you can't really heat treat it the same way you can with steel. However, because you have so much more material there, and because it is such a large blade with so much mass, I'm hoping that you can just smash through things and brute force it. It's a giant sword. It's about brute force. So a lot of those different things that are detrimental to aluminum as a material for a regular sword, when it comes to a giant sword, I think can work. All right, the build project for the giant sword was expensive. It was expensive and it was a big project. It's a giant sword. The aluminum flat bar that I got was a couple of meters long, and it costs over $250, and that's just for that component without anything else. So this one was pricey. Now in terms of the build, what I did was, because I'm going for a guts, Dragonslayer type sword design, that's kind of what I'm aiming for, I just trimmed off the tops to create a point. Very simple, very easy. Then I spent a whole bunch of time with the angle grinder, grinding in bevels and then an edge. It was honestly quite a big pain to actually grind down these bevels and edges. There was aluminum chips flying everywhere. Actually took quite a while, especially because I have such a thick piece of material. Taking off all that extra material for the bevels. Yeah, let's just say I went through a lot of sanding discs, which at $10 a pop can add up quickly. Now, something that I should mention, which is very important, one edge will be sharp. And what I mean by that is it should be a functional edge. It should be able to cut through things. However, the other edge I'm going to leave a little bit more blunt, as in it will have a rounded over surface. But I'll talk more about that in testing, but there is a specific reason why I did this. Anyway, what I needed to do after getting the blade to somewhat of a reasonable state was figure out how I could attach a handle that would be able to handle the stresses and the loads of this type of weapon, right? So what I came up with was kind of a square steel bar, so very strong. Then I'm going to weld on these kind of wings. Now these wings will create more surface area to clamp on to the blade, at least that's the hope. I'll bolt everything together. Then after I've done that, I will clean it up a little bit. Now to finish up the blade, it's actually kind of simple, just to give it some depth and to make it look somewhat pretty. I will mask off the bevels and edges, keep them bare aluminum. Then I will paint the center portion of the blade with a etch primer. This is a tough layer of paint, and it also gives the blade a wicked look, and all of a sudden it looks far more accurate to the original one. In terms of the wrap on the handle, I'm going for a nice Tyrant thread. It's a rather thick paracord. This is something that I would never use on like a regular sword, but because this is such a large handle, a large blade, using a larger and thicker cord actually is really good for this sort of purpose. So I'll wrap that around using epoxy to make sure it stays in place. And with that done, that is the bulk of the build ready to go. So with all that out of the way, it's time to get to the B-roll and then to the testing. All right guys, this build is finally ready. Here I have my giant sword. As you can see, it's pretty big. But before we swing this around, before I tell you how it feels, before we get into any of it, I wanted to set a baseline, because I think a lot of people don't realize that giant swords exist. There are a lot of very large swords out there. There are a lot of techniques that you can use with them, and some people think or don't realize that giant swords, like this is a large sword here, this is relatively light. I can hold this out one hand, no worries at all. Larger swords are made to be wieldable. They are realistic. This one here is like the Honshu Claymore, I think it's called. And as you can see, it's light. Not only is it light, it's also, relatively speaking, rather quick and nimble. Like this isn't a crazy sword, relatively, like it's a large sword, but it doesn't mean it's crazy to use. You still can absolutely do a whole bunch of techniques when it comes to these swords. They're made to be used, specifically things like Montante. Now this one is a little bit short actually, believe it or not. It should be kind of up here, but it is a large sword, especially when you compare it to something like this bastard, this bastard sword, hand and a half sword. It's a large sword. I think you guys get the idea. This one, relatively speaking, not that heavy, can be used rather quick. Now, let's compare it to this big boy. How does it look? Which one's bigger? So this is interesting because I've been thinking about this, I've been mulling it over for a while. What actually makes a giant fantasy sword? Truth is, I don't think it's the length. Don't get me wrong. It helps to have a sword that is like bigger than you, sure. But generally speaking, I think it's the width. If you look at a lot of fantasy sword designs versus real sword designs, the thickness, like the width of the blade, seems to be the biggest determining factor. Just an interesting thought that I had. All right, let's swing it around. Now you guys can tell I'm obviously not in my regular kit. I'm wearing something a little bit more light, and that's because this is gonna tire me out a little bit. Can I spin it around without hitting the ground? I mean, it's close. In terms of crowd control. That one was a bit on the flat. Still heavy, can move it around though. Don't know if that's a selling point.
That is tiring. That's more tiring than you would think. And this is, relatively speaking, rather light. I know you guys want to see me hit some things with this big fucking sword, so let's hit some shit. All right. That was my bad. It rolled in my hands a little bit. Now this is a softer medium, so we should be able to get a nice slice on it, which I believe I did. We've done our cuts. They're a little bit more smashes, if you ask me. Now, obviously, that is a detriment of the material itself. It doesn't really hold too good of an edge. I have put two different types of edges, I should mention. One edge is like sharp, and one edge is a bit more bludgeoning. And the reason why I think that is because if you have such a large giant sword, right, you would want to be able to cut things, but you would also want to be able to bludgeon things. For example, we've got Tony here. I'm gonna hit Tony. I mean, that's no surprise, everybody knows I'm gonna do that anyway. Because I have so much weight here, because I have so much mass here, it's a giant sword, of course, using the more blunter edge, I can use it as a blunt force weapon. So let's smash the construction helmet, we've got our steel plate, and then let's just hit Tony in the chest, because why not? So right down on his head. Sorry, Tony, this one will hurt. Let's try and hold this one so it doesn't roll as much. That one glanced again. Who would have thought construction helmets have some really excellent armor angling? It doesn't feel too terrible in the hand when it hits solid objects. I thought it would feel worse, so that's definitely a plus. Of course, there is always one. There is always one. Let's hit the steel shoulders. They shouldn't be able to move at all. So we'll be able to see how much damage this thing can do. Now it's interesting, because the weight on this is a lot more homogeneous, right? In terms of like a steel blade, it usually would want a distal taper and a profile taper to remove a lot of that weight. This one doesn't have it. I do think if I was to make this again, I would probably give it a profile taper, not a distal taper, because I still want that thickness to keep the blade nice and chunky, right? But definitely a little bit of a profile taper, I think would help balance it a little bit more, because when you hold it like this, no problems. I can use that. No, it's like a giant, it's like a sword spear. Sword spear, no worries, right? But the moment you have to do it in one hand and you bring that leverage all the way down here, yeah, even with this, which is a lighter blade, still too much, man. So there's a steel plate on Tony's shoulder right here. I'm gonna come down as hard as I can right there. Let's see what type of damage we can inflict on it. That was a direct hit, felt solid, felt good, felt reasonable. Ooh, 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 ooh. This was bent before. So it has mass, it has ability to inflict damage, but is that better than any other weapon that can concentrate that, that force just that bit better, because this one is still heavy compared to most other weapons, right? I don't know if it's worth the trade-off. Don't know if it's worth the trade-off. Oh, I'm just practicing my Berserk poses, don't mind me. I mean, while you're here, you can consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. So thrusting, would you thrust like this, or would you use it like a regular sword and try and thrust like that? Well, let's try both, see if any feel any different. That was solid. That felt solid as Tony didn't stand a chance on that one. Damn, I actually feel a bit bad for that one. I'm sorry, dude. All right, thrusting like this. They felt exactly the same. The only difference is I felt like I had more control with this one. But obviously that does open me up because my hands are a little bit lower, right? But again, that gets into is like, is this even necessary? Is this required as a weapon? The craziest thing I felt with this, and I didn't really say it in the cut test because I kind of wanted to save it until a little bit later in the episode, and that is aiming. This thing fucking sucks at aiming. The moment I have this thing spinning, right? The moment I have some momentum on it, I can't actually really change the direction. Because you have so much force and mass going, trying to adjust your aim, very difficult actually. Not good, because it has so much weight and mass that if it glances, it's hard for the recovery, right? You've had that big wind up, you hit something, you miss something, trying to recover that. Too heavy. I am going to brace the sword here. Actually, I'm going to brace it a little bit further down near the sweet spot, because I am going to take this real steel sword. It is a little f***ed up, okay, I will acknowledge, but it is still steel and it does still have an edge. And I'm going to strike down into this aluminum blade and see what type of damage that we can induce. And the reason why this is important is because, like I said, having a material in sufficient thicknesses will outperform other things simply based on thickness alone. So, as you can see, all it's done is created some big jagged gouges. Now you're probably thinking, well, that's no good. What are we going to do now? Well, the truth of the matter is, these things can be easily fixed because of the material choice. On top of that, they are now all serrated edges. They are very, very sharp. So it's not as much damage as you would think, right? Relatively speaking, that's not bad. All right, I've hit enough things. It is time to get to Tyrant's initial thoughts score, or TITS for short. This thing is heavy. It's on the limit of what I would consider to be like usable, right? And you gotta remember, we're using something light like aluminum. I do think a profile taper would have helped a little bit in this regard, but still, it's just very unwieldy, you know? Having a giant sword, something like an actual giant sword, they're a lot thinner, so you're able to move them quite nimbly, like I said earlier in the episode. But when it came to this one, it just really didn't feel that good. It was heavy because like the points of leverage, the weight distribution of this is very homogeneous, right? So the weight throughout the whole thing is, relatively speaking, equal, meaning when you get down to these leverage points here, because you're so far away from the weight at the tip, it's just it's quite difficult. In terms of aiming, oh my, there was very difficult to aim with this thing. You pretty much had to, okay, I want to aim there, I'm gonna now load it up, swing it, and if I miss, I can't correct it in the swing. So it was very difficult to aim with this thing, especially hitting smaller targets. All right, there are a couple of extra points that I did want to mention just before we get into the ranking. First of all, speed. You can move this relatively quickly, however, the moment that momentum is gone, your recovery time is so slow. Somebody can close that distance very easily, especially if they have any sort of weapon, a sword, a spear. Phew. So that is a huge detriment to this thing, the recovery time. On top of that, there are other things like leverage. For example, when you spin one of these swords around, all of the mass and speed is up near the tip. You do not want to get hit with a giant sword here. However, down here, the speed is actually relatively not too bad. And if you were able to get your crossguard in here, you could probably stop one of these things relatively easy, because all of the mass is that way, all of the speed and danger is up there. So if you catch a giant sword early on in its swing down here, you're probably going to be all right. But then when it comes to like, where would you even use one of these? What would be the use case? Well, the thing is, I mean, you need a wide area to kind of use it. In terms of using it like a spear, I mean, a spear is much more lighter, much easier to make, and much more nimble. So against a spear, I think this would lose. How about in a duel? I mean, yeah, I guess maybe if this was like a dueling weapon, kinda. The thing is, I don't know how effective it would be even in a dueling sense, because, I mean, the recovery time. The recovery time is kind of not good. As soon as the momentum's lost, I think you're in a spot of bother. On top of that, it uses a shit ton of stamina. If I was a Dark Souls character, my stamina bar is depleting almost instantly. When it comes to blocking with this blade, I'm not even sure how you would go about it. And the reason why I say that is because, again, that momentum. When you want to block someone's strike, the problem is the blade isn't moving. So once you block, it's very difficult to get into for a counterattack quickly, right? So with one of these, your reach is your greatest advantage. However, if someone else has reach, what are you going to do? And then there are some obvious ones like your tight spaces, like hallways, doorways. When you have people around you, using something this big is going to be kind of difficult. But then again, that same that same point could be applied to other large swords and other large weapons. That's fair, but it is also a valid point, especially for this one as well. Starting off with comfort. I mean, there wasn't anything too egregious about it. The handle is relatively comfortable. It didn't feel too bad when I was hitting things like Tony or the helmet or anything like that. It felt reasonably comfortable. So for comfort, I'm more than happy to give it something like a 6. It's not the best, but at the same time, it was not like unusable. When it came to the design is interesting because this is more of the guts, Dragonslayer sword. This isn't like, lots of different giant swords have different designs. I think what I'm going to be ranking specifically is fantasy giant swords. And what that means is width-wise, because obviously a real, large swords, big swords, we have them really tall, but they're very thin. This is just so thick, and that seems to be the common denominator between most fantasy giant swords, is that they're just really wide. So that's what I'm talking about when it comes to design. I'm gonna give that like a 4. I'm not a fan of it. There wasn't really too much that was helped in the way of the design, specifically in it being so wide and thick. I mean, it did help when it came to the edge damage. Because it's so wide, you don't really have to worry about the edges at all, really. Like, that is almost, I would say, about 8 millimeters deep in terms of these cuts, but because we have such a wide blade, it's meaningless. So that is a positive of it, but at the same time, in a general sense, I feel like there's more detriments than positives. So for design, I am somewhere around, the 4. I think 4 is reasonable for that. When it comes to the effectiveness, it's reasonably effective. It's a very big thing that has a lot of mass. It will f you up. The counter to that is, like, a spear is so much more nimble. It would be able to, like, you are so much faster with a spear. It slows you down too much. So it can be quite effective. You can smash things. The blunt force that it can deal is pretty good. However, something that is made for it, like a hammer or something that has a beak, just something that concentrates that force a lot more efficiently, will do more damage. This feels kind of like a jack of all trades, master of none, but even then there are other equivalents that do better jobs than this. I just don't really see a huge need for it, really. Yeah. I mean, let me know in the comments. Maybe you guys have got some scenarios where this would be perfect. This would be the perfect thing. Like maybe dueling someone one-on-one. But relatively speaking, yeah, it can deal a bit of damage, but that doesn't really mean it's effective. So yeah, for effectiveness, the highest I would want to go for something like this is a 7. I just don't think I could go any higher. Especially since it's so hard to change the trajectory of your cuts. Once you start swinging, that mass is just so hard to change. Like, yeah, it makes it less of it. Anyway. All right, the last and final category. Now, this is the one where it's like, yeah, this is probably controversial. Wieldability. I mean, you can wield it. It's really hard and it's very exhausting. Especially when you compare it to like a Zweihander or a Claymore war sword, just like a large sword that actually exists. This thing is multiple times more exhausting and you don't get that much more benefit. You really, really don't. And then that's just comparing it to swords. Compare this to like a spear or a halberd, they nowhere near are as difficult as this thing. This thing is actually quite hard to use. It's just the mass. The mass is really a problem. And keep in mind, this is a relatively speaking, a light example. I would probably put this one, I think when I weighed it once it was finished, around about the 16-pound mark. So maybe like 8 kilos-ish or 7 kilos-ish. So like, it's relatively light. However, because it's so long and that weight is distributed so evenly, it makes it very, very difficult. This isn't like a proper sword that has a counterbalance so that so the tip feels a lot more nimble. This just shares all that weight, all that mass throughout the whole thing. And guess what? Gravity's a bitch. For wieldability, a 4. I mean, if you make it out of the right materials, you can use it, you can spin it around, but does that mean it's good? Does that mean that it's better than other things? Nah, not really, man. So that gives us a final score of 21 out of 40, kind of right down the center, just over halfway. Yeah, I wasn't too impressed by it, honestly. I thought it would do better. I thought it would be more crazy, but yeah, middling.
Okay, I don't want to end today's episode in such a negative tone. Honestly, I was very tired. Everything I said was still accurate, but I was tired. So once I got the footage into editing, I realized there's potential here. The sword didn't bend, break, or warp, and it was quite quick and nimble, relatively speaking, when you compare it to like other giant swords on the internet. So having said that, I think this is going to be part 1 of a 2-part series. I'm hoping in the coming months we can modify the giant sword, make it even lighter and more nimble, and give it some razor sharp steel edges, and retest it. So that's a much more positive tone to end today's episode on. But that's going to be all. If you haven't subscribed, I genuinely hope I've earned your subscription today. You can also support the channel down below. It helps me make this type of content. I really would appreciate it. But that's going to be all. Thank you guys for watching. Have a good one.